George Patton did not need help becoming a legend. By January of 1945, he had already done the thing generals dream of and staff officers swear is impossible. He had turned an entire army in the dead of winter, driven it north through ice and panic, and helped break the German grip around Bastogne. That is the part engraved in bronze. But 3 days after New Year's, Patton opened his private diary and wrote about another field. Not a field where Americans had been murdered, a field where Americans had done the murdering. And then he wrote the line that the army would spend decades making easier to read. He hoped it could be concealed. To understand why that line matters, you have to begin 2 weeks earlier, just after noon on December 17, 1944. The place was Bogne's Crossroads, outside the Belgian town of Malmedy. Snow covered the ground, the sky was low and colorless. A column of American trucks and jeeps was moving along a road that should have been safe. The men in those vehicles were not tank destroyers. They were not infantry assault troops. Most were artillery observers from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. Their job was to help other guns hit targets miles away. They had carbines, pistols, a few light weapons. Nothing that mattered when the lead vehicles of an SS armored spearhead came around the road. The German column belonged to Kampfgruppe Pieper, the fast-moving spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division. Its commander, Joachim Pieper, was 29 years old, ambitious, and already shaped by the Eastern Front, where his unit had earned a reputation for brutality against prisoners and civilians. His orders in the Ardennes were simple in spirit: drive west, drive fast, do not be slowed down, and prisoners slow an armored column down. The Americans at Bognes had no realistic fight to make. Some tried to escape in vehicles. Most were trapped almost immediately. They were disarmed, stripped of valuables, pushed off the road, and herded into an open field beside the crossroads. More than 100 men stood there in the cold with empty hands. Many of them still believed the rules of war were about to operate. A prisoner was supposed to be moved to the rear. A captured man was supposed to live. Then, according to survivors, a shot cracked from a German vehicle. Then the machine guns opened. Men fell into the snow. Some dropped because bullets hit them. Some dropped because instinct told them that the only way to live was to look dead before death found them. The first firing was not the worst part. The worst part came when the firing slowed. German soldiers moved among the bodies with pistols, listening for men who groaned, men who breathed too loudly, men who tried to crawl, a shot, a step, another shot, not battle, inspection. Some Americans ran toward the woods and escaped. Some hid in a building near the crossroads. The SS set that building on fire and shot men as they came out. When the field was finally counted, 84 American prisoners were dead. The number was not just a casualty figure. It was a message that passed through the American army faster than radio traffic. Because these men had not died trying to take a hill. They had surrendered. Their weapons were gone. Their hands were empty. And the story reached American lines almost immediately. A few survivors crawled, stumbled, and ran through the snow until they reached friendly troops. Associated Press correspondent Hal Boyle interviewed some of them while the shock was still raw. His dispatch carried the story across the Atlantic and across the American front. By the next day, people in the United States were reading about murdered prisoners at breakfast. But the more important audience was closer. Men in foxholes heard it. Men in trucks heard it. Men shivering in the Ardennes heard it. And the words changed temperature as they moved from unit to unit. At first it was news. Then it became warning. Then it became permission. Some American units began treating SS men differently. Some spoke openly of refusing quarter. One infantry regiment put the ugliness into writing. SS troops and German paratroopers were not to be taken prisoner. That order was illegal. It was also understandable in the way terrible things often become understandable in war. The men who wrote it knew what had happened at Malmedy. They believed the enemy had already torn up the rules. And once one side convinces itself that rules are dead, the dead rules do not rise again just because the next prisoner puts his hands up. This was the air in the Ardennes by late December. Murdered Americans in a Belgian field. Rumors that were mostly true. Rage moving faster than discipline. And into that air came George S. Patton. The first thing Patton did was magnificent. There is no honest version of this story that takes that away from him. When the German offensive began on December 16th, Patton's Third Army was far to the south, attacking east in Lorraine. Its maps, fuel, road movements, artillery plans, and momentum were all pointed the wrong way. A normal army does not simply pivot 90 degrees in winter, not in the Ardennes, not on ice, not while roads are choked with refugees, wrecked vehicles, supply trucks, ambulances, and units that do not know where the enemy is. But Patton had suspected for weeks that the Germans might be preparing something in the American center. While other commanders saw a beaten enemy, Patton saw a quiet enemy, and a quiet enemy to him was dangerous, so he had ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for turning north. Those plans were not theater. They were routes, timetables, fuel calculations, bridge questions, traffic control, and units assigned to roads that did not yet have permission to carry them. On December 19th, Eisenhower gathered his senior commanders in Verdun. The German attack had torn a great bulge into the Allied line. Bastogne was becoming the hinge of the fight. The American front needed a counterstroke from the south. When Eisenhower asked what Patton could do, Patton said he could attack north with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room thought he was boasting. Patton was not boasting. He had already done the staff work. He stepped out, made the call, and the machinery began moving. In roughly 3 days, more than 100,000 men, vehicles, guns, and supplies began turning toward the southern shoulder of the Bulge. The roads were frozen. Engines failed. Guns jammed. Men slept in vehicles that felt like steel coffins. The weather punished everything mechanical and everything human. Still, the Third Army turned. On the morning of December 22nd, Patton's divisions attacked north. Their target was Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne and attached units were surrounded, undersupplied, short on winter gear, short on medical capacity, and refusing to give the Germans the answer they wanted. When the German commander demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe answered with one word: nuts. It was funny only because it was defiant. The situation itself was not funny at all. The men in Bastogne were freezing. The wounded were piling up. Supplies were scarce. The German ring around the town was still trying to crush them. Patton's spearhead, the 4th Armored Division, fought north through towns, roadblocks, mines, anti-tank fire, and weather that made every mile feel earned twice. On December 26th, near dusk, elements of the 37th Tank Battalion broke through and made contact with the airborne perimeter. Bastogne was not free from danger, but it was no longer alone. That is the public Patton story. The hard turn, the frozen roads, the relief column. The general who moved faster than the Germans believed possible, and it deserves its place. But it is not the whole answer to what Patton did after Malmedy. Because after Malmedy, American rage did not stay symbolic. It traveled with the army. It reached units that had never seen the Bognes field. It reached men who had lost friends, or expected to lose friends, or had simply heard enough to decide that an SS uniform had become a confession. And on New Year's Day, 1945, that rage reached a village west of Bastogne called Chenogne. Chenogne was not a famous place. It was a small Belgian village caught in the grinding fight after Bastogne had been relieved. The 11th Armored Division was newly committed, inexperienced, and taking heavy punishment in its first real combat. Green troops are not gentle troops by nature. They are frightened, overloaded, furious, and learning war at the worst possible speed. The men of the 11th Armored had heard the word Malmedy. They had heard what Pieper's men had done. They had heard, like so many American soldiers by then, that the rules were not being honored by the enemy. On January 1st, after savage fighting around Chenogne, American soldiers rounded up German prisoners. Some were wounded, some were medics. Some were simply beaten men who had stopped fighting. They were marched into a field. Then American machine guns fired. The number has never settled cleanly. That is part of the problem. Some accounts place it around 20. Others go higher. Some historians and witnesses have argued figures near 60 or even more. The exact count remains disputed because the army did not treat the field as a crime scene. But the moral fact does not depend on the final number. Disarmed German prisoners were killed after capture. Wounded men and medical personnel were among the dead. And that made Chenogne, in the essential sense, the same crime Americans were condemning at Malmedy. Not the same scale, not the same command structure, not the same ideological machine behind it, but the same broken rule. A prisoner who cannot fight is not a target. A medic is not a target. A man with his hands up is not a target. George Patton knew. We know he knew because he wrote it down. On January 4th, 3 days after the killings, Patton made a diary entry about the 11th Armored Division. For decades, the published version softened the event into cold administrative language. It said there had been unfortunate incidents in the shooting of prisoners. Then came the line, "I hope we can conceal this." That line is bad enough. But later historians examining Patton's original handwritten diary found the private version was sharper. Patton had not merely written about incidents. He had written, in substance, that his men had murdered roughly 50 German medics. Murdered, that was his word. Not lost control, not fired in confusion, not combat mistake. Murdered, and then he hoped it could be concealed. The difference matters because edited history often does not lie by inventing. It lies by sanding. A word becomes cleaner, a crime becomes an incident, a field becomes an uncomfortable detail. A general's private recognition becomes a public ambiguity, and with enough sanding, a massacre can pass into memory as a rumor instead of a record. This was not the first time Patton had faced the murder of prisoners by men under his command. In Sicily in 1943, American troops had killed groups of Italian and German prisoners near Bastogne. That case could not be buried so easily. Omar Bradley wanted accountability. Investigators found no valid provocation. Patton, after some hesitation, accepted the need for trials. His answer then was brutal and clear. Try the bastards. Men were tried. One sergeant was convicted. One lieutenant was acquitted after claiming that Patton's own aggressive pre-battle language had shaped what he thought was expected. But at least there was a process. At least the killing of prisoners was treated as a crime. Sicily produced trials. Chenogne produced a diary line. That difference tells you what the Ardennes had done. It tells you what Malmedy had done. By January 1945, the American army was not at the beginning of its education in war. It had been through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the hedgerows, the pursuit across France, and the freezing shock of Hitler's last Western offensive. The moral muscle was tired, and tired moral muscles fail quietly. They fail in words like conceal. There is a temptation here to make Patton simple, to call him hero or hypocrite, to make the story morally easy because easy stories are easier to package and easier to remember. But Patton was not simple. He could be theatrical, profane, brilliant, vain, cruel, brave, and operationally astonishing. He could demand discipline in one theater and tolerate silence in another. He could be sickened by Nazi atrocity and still choose concealment when the dead prisoners were German and the shooters were his own men. In April 1945, when Patton's troops reached Ohrdruf, the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by American forces, the horror shook him. He forced local German civilians to look at what had been done in their name. That was moral clarity. Chenogne was moral failure. The same man contained both, and that is why the diary matters more than a simple accusation ever could. It does not show a cartoon villain. It shows a commander who recognized murder when his own side committed it, and then hoped the institution could hide it. Now compare what happened after Malmedy with what happened after Chenogne. The men of Kampfgruppe Paper were hunted, arrested, and tried. In 1946 at Dachau, 74 defendants stood before an American military tribunal for crimes committed during the Ardennes offensive. The case covered far more than the 84 men killed at Bastogne. Prosecutors tied Pieper's command to the deaths of hundreds of American prisoners and more than 100 Belgian civilians. The tribunal found all 74 guilty. 43 men, including Joachim Pieper, were sentenced to hang. For a moment, it looked like the machinery of justice had answered the field at Malmedy. Then the machinery began to slow. Defense lawyers argued that confessions had been obtained through improper interrogation methods, including mock trials. Some allegations were exaggerated or unproven. Some procedural abuses had enough substance to create a political weapon. That weapon became stronger as the world changed. By 1948, the Cold War had redrawn the map of American priorities. West Germany was no longer simply the defeated enemy. It was becoming a necessary partner against the Soviet Union. Executing dozens of German soldiers became politically inconvenient. German religious leaders protested. German public pressure built. American politicians took up the cause, including Senator Joseph McCarthy, who attacked the conduct of the investigation and showed sympathy for the convicted SS men. Review followed review. Sentences came down. Death became life. Life became a term of years. And then the prison doors opened. By the end of 1956, every convicted member of Kampfgruppe Pieper had been released. Pieper himself served a little more than 11 years. 11 years for a command tied to murdered prisoners and civilians across the Ardennes. He lived under controversy, worked for major German firms for a time, and eventually settled in France under another name. In 1976, after his identity was exposed, his house was firebombed. His body was found in the ruins. No one was convicted for his death. That ending feels like vengeance because vengeance is easier to feel than justice. But it does not balance the record. It does not answer Chenogne. The Americans who killed prisoners there did not face a Dachau trial. There were no death sentences to commute, no prison terms to reduce, no defense lawyers, no Senate hearings, no public argument over interrogation methods, no national memory of the murdered men. There was only a field, an entry in Patton's diary, and an institutional decision to let silence do its work. This is the part nations hate to remember. Not because it proves both sides were the same. They were not. Nazi Germany built mass murder into its state, its ideology, and its war. The SS carried criminality as doctrine, not as accident. The massacre at Malmedy came from an organization already trained to treat certain lives as disposable. That distinction matters. But distinction is not absolution. The fact that one side fought a monstrous regime does not make every act by that side clean. The fact that the Allies were right to defeat Nazi Germany does not make every Allied trigger pull righteous. And the fact that American soldiers were enraged by a real atrocity does not turn captured men into legal targets. The hard truth is not that the Americans were secretly the same as the SS. The hard truth is that even the army fighting the right war can commit the wrong act, recognize it, and bury it because victory gives it the shovel. Winners do not only write history. Sometimes they edit the handwriting. That is what makes the Patton diary so powerful. The public story needed him as the man who answered Malmedy with motion. An army turned, a siege relieved, a German offensive broken. The private page shows another answer. He answered Chenogne with silence. He had the authority to demand an investigation. He had the precedent of Bastogne. He had the vocabulary because he used the word murder. What he did not have or did not choose to use was the will to expose his own men in the middle of a war that had already made mercy feel dangerous. That choice worked. For decades, most Americans knew Malmedy. Almost none knew Chenogne. Bastogne became a symbol. Chenogne became a footnote. One field entered the moral memory of the war. The other was left outside the fence. And the difference was not that one field mattered and the other did not. The difference was that one crime was useful to remember and the other was useful to forget. So when the question is what George Patton did after American prisoners were executed in cold blood, the honest answer has two halves. He did what great commanders do. He moved faster than the enemy, turned his army north, helped relieve Bastogne, and struck the southern flank of Hitler's last gamble in the West. And he did what institutions do when the wrong truth threatens the right myth. He saw murder by his own side, named it privately, and hoped it could disappear. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. That is the burden of real history. It does not ask you to trade one truth for a cleaner one. It asks you to hold them together. Patton broke the siege. Patton hid the field. The snow at Bastogne was reported within a day. The snow at Chenogne was buried for a lifetime. And somewhere between those two fields is the difference between the war we prefer to remember and the war that actually happened.